This is a broad overview of logic and critical thinking, or as the Philosophy 140 course is called, logic and reasoning. So we're going to be looking at some definitions fairly quickly. How to identify arguments, which is the bulk of what this video will concern, and extended arguments, what they look like and how to address those. So first of all, for definitions, an argument is a connected series of statements that is intended to establish the truth of a proposition. This is a definition taken from a comedy skit that I'll mention later, but it's a perfectly adequate definition. So the idea is that you have a proposition that you intend to establish, and that's the conclusion of the argument. That's the main point that the speaker or the writer wants you to believe. So we have the conclusion. Every argument has a conclusion. And then the supporting claims, the reasons provided for the conclusion, are the premises. And so these consist in verbal evidence. These are written or spoken statements that are intended to support the conclusion. So we have these parts in every argument. We say premises. Most arguments have more than one premise, but it is actually possible to have an argument with merely one premise. Now, in standard form, how we lay out the argument so that it is very clear an argument is being presented, we have premises that are listed individually. Then you have a line below those, and following the premises and the line are the conclusions. That's how you put it in standard form. Typically, we will enumerate those so we can specify premise number 2 in a discussion, for example. Here's an example of an argument. So we have two premises here. To succeed in business, one must be able to think clearly. Bill Gates has succeeded in business, and from that, we have the line and the conclusion. Therefore, Bill Gates is able to think clearly. Now, the final claim, as we said, is the conclusion. The first two claims then are the premises. They are intended to support the conclusion, intended to give you reason to believe the conclusion. Here's another example. In the 2012 season, the Cardinals won more playoff games than the Cubs had won in the previous 20 years. Taking the 2011 and 2012 seasons combined, the Cardinals won more playoff games than the Cubs had won in the previous 100 years. And those are premises leading up to the conclusion that up to 2012, the Cardinals were a better team than the Cubs. Now, you may not agree with the argument, you may disagree with some of the premises, but this is an argument. We have 1 and 2 premises, the line, and the conclusion. Now, logic and critical thinking can be defined in 2 different ways. So we have logic, the formal study of arguments, and that's concerned with the structure of an argument. And the main concern is whether or not the premises actually support the conclusion. That's logic, the study of argumentation and how the premises do or do not support the conclusion. Now, critical thinking is broader. It could include logic, we might say. It involves the question of whether the premises are true. It involves what kind of evidence is appropriate for the premises. It involves many other things to make sure that we are thinking clearly. So logic is a more formal endeavor. Critical thinking is broader and has to be concerned with all kinds of aspects of clear thinking. Now, arguments themselves, what they are not. First of all, arguments are not merely contradictions where two people take opposing sides and then have a disagreement. That in itself is not an argument. An argument is an intellectual process, right? It's not just two people disagreeing about something. There are premises being presented, reasons to believe something being presented. And it's certainly not merely a heated emotional exchange. Now, of course, we can use that word argument in our everyday language to refer to a heated emotional exchange, but that's not what an argument is, nor is an argument a physical confrontation. Now, that's not an argument, right? That's a fight. And it's not merely an explanation of why you believe something. Sometimes people may explain why they believe something, but they're not providing reasons for anyone else to believe things. So somebody might say, if you smoke marijuana, then you probably think it should be legalized. Well, that might explain why somebody thinks it should be legalized, but it's not an argument. It's not a reason for anyone else to accept the belief that marijuana should be legalized. Not that in itself. On YouTube, you can find the Argument Clinic. You can do a search for Monty Python Argument Clinic. If you've never seen that before, I encourage you to do that. The reason I'm not putting the link here is because often people put up the video and then it gets taken down, but there is an official Monty Python channel, I believe. In any case, I'm sure you can find it on YouTube, and I encourage you to view that. And as I mentioned previously, I'm actually borrowing their definition of an argument in that skit, which is a perfectly legitimate definition. It's very functional. Okay, let's move on to indicator words. We have words that give us a clue what the piece of statement, what the statements are doing, what this piece of the argument's function is. So we have words like since and because and for. And when we see these often separate a conclusion from a premise. So the conclusion comes first, the conclusion precedes these words, and then the premises follow. And that makes sense, of course, because you have a statement and then you're giving reasons to believe the statement. So you have a statement, since tells you here are the reasons you should believe it, or because tells you here are the reasons you should believe that statement. So for example, if somebody was at a meeting and it's about time to start and somebody asked about, is John coming? And somebody says, well, he will be late, for he said that if he has to go to the store, then he'd be late, and he has to go to the store. This is an argument. Now, it's not a argument that's controversial, that it's not something people are going to disagree about much, but it is a statement and then reasons provided to believe the statement. So the conclusion is the very first statement, he will be late. We have the word for, and then it gives you reasons to accept that statement. We have other words that often indicate a conclusion is coming. So these, when you see these words, the conclusion is following what is stated here, these phrases or words. So therefore, of course, one of the most common indicators that you have a conclusion. Hence, thus, so is very common. It follows that phrase. We should believe that would be another one, right? These all indicate the conclusion is going to follow the phrase. So whenever you see these words, that should tell you that you have an argument and the conclusion is coming up. Now, there are other indications of argumentation. So the following are often, but not always, indicate an argument is taking place. Words like suppose, if, then, which are often found together. If and a phrase, then and another phrase. Either, or, but, and, not, only, some, all, only if. Obviously, these words are found in our English language in all kinds of places, especially conjunctions like but and. But these often include reasons to believe something. So here's an if statement, right? So example, if it's October, the leaves are turning, it's October. So another indicator word that the conclusion is coming up, so the leaves are turning. That's an argument. Again, maybe not an interesting argument, maybe not one worth stating for anyone, but it is an argument. And the if gives you a sense of reasoning that is coming up. So these terms are often used in arguments, but of course, they're often used in many, many other ways, and they are found all over the place in our English language. So sometimes some of the argument indicator words that I've mentioned, words like because and if and consequently, which would indicate a conclusion is coming up, these can be used in different ways, of course. So because doesn't always say, here's a reason to believe something, but instead it sometimes say, here is the cause of what we are stating. So if somebody says Western won the game because Turk played so well, that is not an argument. It's somebody giving a causal explanation for why we won. It's not an argument. The conclusion, if it were an argument, would be Western won the game. But in this context, you can see that that's not what is controversial. No one's trying to convince you of that. Or B here, if you don't stop running around the house, I'm going to scream. Now that's not an argument. It's more of a threat, right? Or I ran into the carport post and consequently the carport collapsed. Now that might be something you put on an insurance statement, but it's not something that is an argument. Okay, so there are several questions that one might ask in order to determine whether an argument is being presented. So you can find these in the Salmon text if you're taking 140 and you have that text or the reading. But these are the questions. So I'm borrowing these from Merrily Salmon. What is the main point of the speaker or writer? So you want to ask that anytime you're reading. What's the main point? Anytime you have a paragraph, you want to identify the main point, the thesis of the paragraph. So you would ask that. If you're reading philosophy, that often will indicate that you're identifying the conclusion, right? The main point would be the conclusion. The second question here is the speaker or writer presenting evidence to support the truth of some assertion. Obviously, if the answer is yes to that, then we have an argument, right? Verbal evidence is being presented. These are reasons why you should believe something, give you reasons to think the assertion is true. So that would be an argument. For number 3 here, however, is the speaker or writer trying to explain why something happened when the fact that it happened is not in dispute. That would be like our carport example on the previous slide. That would not be an argument. If you answer yes to that question, we have something that's not an argument. And also for 4, is a merely illustrative example being presented. And of course, if that's the case, it's not an argument. The illustrative examples might be in the context of a broader argument, just to help you understand the claims that are being made, but they're not serving as verbal evidence themselves. They are not themselves premises. So this would not be an argument. Often when we have arguments presented, especially in conversation, but this is true as well when it comes to written work, that sometimes arguments are incompletely stated. And in those cases, you have to fill in what goes unstated in order to understand the full, proper structure of the argument, the reasoning that's taking place. So often an unstated premise is assumed to be known by the reader or listener. It's assumed that they can kind of fill in the gaps, but it's important when we're assessing an argument, when we're constructing the formal structure of the argument, that we go ahead and state the obvious. And you especially need to do this if you're going to criticize an argument. So here's some examples that we can practice on. Suppose we had this argument: marijuana should not be legalized because it has potentially dangerous long-term effects. We see that word because is serving its indicator role. We have the first statement, that's the point that the person wants you to believe. We have because, and so we have the premise supporting that first statement. But it doesn't follow directly that if something has potentially dangerous long-term effects, that it should not be legalized, right? So what might be the missing premise? It seems like if you're going to be charitable here and assume that the person has an argument in mind, is really presenting a reason, the missing premise is going to be something like this: anything that has potentially dangerous long-term effects should not be legalized. There's some kind of statement like that. Now, if there's actual disagreement going on, we would want to identify that premise, make it explicit, and then allow the person presenting the argument to either say, yes, I do believe that, and that is how I'm getting to the conclusion, or no, it's something else, and then you can talk it through. In this case, it looks like that must be the missing premise. Here is another example. We should not pursue another mission to the moon because it would cost more than what we spend on agriculture in most states. Here, we're also using the word because. I guess I wasn't very creative there, but we have the first statement as the conclusion: we should not pursue another mission to the moon. We have the word because. The premise follows: it would cost more than what we spend on agriculture in most states. Now, again, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. There must be a missing premise. There must be something connecting that premise with the conclusion. So what might that be? Well, it must be something like this: we should not spend more on scientific investigations than on agriculture. Right? Something like that must be the missing premise. Again, if you're in a conversation with someone, you can ask, do you also believe this? Is that how you get to your conclusion, or is there some other claim? Here, it seems to be charitable to attribute this as a missing premise. All right, one more time here. The value of the Greek system on campus is primarily related to social benefits. Thus, participation in a fraternity or sorority hinders one's education. Now, we do have an indicator word, the word thus. So we have the first statement is the premise. What follows at the end is the conclusion. Again, the conclusion clearly does not directly follow from that premise, so there must be a missing premise. What could it be? Well, in this case, it looks like it must be something like that which primarily provides social benefits is a hindrance to education. If the person had said that, the conclusion would follow. Again, of course, there might be more discussion about why you would think that missing premise is true or not. So when we see arguments where they are being presented and the premises really don't connect clearly with the conclusion, it's often because there's a missing premise, something that is presumed to be true. It's presumed that the hearer, the listener, or the reader believes something else to connect them. But if we're going to assess arguments, analyze arguments, criticize arguments, we want to make these missing premises very clear. Extended arguments are a series of related arguments or sub-arguments. So extended arguments are large arguments that contain other arguments within them. So we might call these sub-arguments. Sub-arguments are used to support conclusions. Of course, if they're an argument, that's what they do. But the conclusions are then used as premises in a larger argument. And this would be the case for any work in philosophy. You are going to find extended arguments. And we can condense these, we can identify the main premises, but then you will typically find arguments that give reason to support the premises, to believe the premises. So in extended arguments, we have to separate the sub-arguments in order to evaluate the merits of the entire argument that is extended. And then once separated, you have these individual arguments, and then you identify those, and you evaluate those as you would with any other argument. So this is often what we find in philosophical works. In fact, books in philosophy are often one long extended argument for a single main conclusion. Now, there are some non-essential aspects of arguments very often. So times where you will have more than just premises and conclusions, even within sub-arguments. There are other aspects of writing that people add. Sometimes they are explanatory sentences, giving background information maybe about a topic to make sure that the reader or listener understands what is being presented. Sometimes there are some emotional appeals. Now, again, that's not something that would be part of an argument, as we discussed in our section on persuasion methods. Sometimes there are aspects that are intended to promote emotional readiness for the conclusion. So sometimes there are stories that are told that kind of get you in an emotional state so that you might be more willing to consider the conclusion, whether or not it's true. Those are not themselves arguments. Those are not reasons to believe things, but when we write, when we speak, we often add these to arguments. Sometimes you merely have supportive illustrations, such as ones you've seen in this video, where we provide a definition or we talk about missing premises and then we give examples, right? So sometimes in arguments, that's the case. You have a premise and then you illustrate how that premise would work, right? So maybe you would have a moral thesis, such as the morally right thing to do is whatever promotes happiness, a utilitarian thesis. And then you would have illustrations that show how that worked to help the reader understand what your claim is. Now, for those of you in Philosophy 140, you should make sure you go ahead and complete the assigned tasks that are related to this material in Unit A of Section 1. And so you will find that on Western Online.